Hey, Monotype is packing its bags and heading to South by Southwest this year. And there are two important dates we want to tell you about. On March 13th, we'll be hosting the very first live recording of Creative Characters, and we'd love you to join us for a conversation about the reasons we fall in love with fonts and why it matters to all of us in the creative world. There'll be an audience Q&A and a fun, hands-on activity with our type design team. Oh, and food and drinks too. You can register for this event on our website. Go to mntype.co/SXSW. That's mntype.co/SXSW. You can also find the link in the show notes of this episode. Then, on March 14th, we'll be hosting a panel discussion that explores the building blocks of a modern brand. It'll be moderated by our longtime Creative Characters host, Charles Nix, along with leaders from Pantone, Getty Images, and Canva. You're not going to want to miss it. Register on the South by Southwest website. That's sxsw.com. And search for the ingredients for building a modern brand. Say hello to us if you do come by. We hope to see you there. Monotype.
Welcome to Creative Characters from Monotype, a show where we meet the people working at the intersection of type and everyday life. I'm your host, Livia, and I'm excited to be here today with Charles Nix. What's going on today, Charles?
I'm glad to be on this podcast with a new voice. Livia, you and I work together, but this is the first time that we've recorded together. It's exciting.
I'm really excited too. It's only my second time on the podcast, so I feel like a little bit of a newbie here with an old Creative Characters veteran, it seems like.
Well, you've got the voice for podcasting, so.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm really excited to hear about our guest today, Charles. Can you tell me a little bit more about Steffi Marty?
Sure. Steffi is the Global Director of Brand Identity at Mars Snacking. She's been with Mars for a long time, and we work together. She and I work together on a typeface called Altogether and Altogether Sans with the agency JKR. And Altogether and Altogether Sans are the official typefaces of M&Ms. So Altogether Sans is a slab serif, and yeah, if you've seen any of M&M's packaging of late or promos on television, or I saw it this past week in the airport at JFK, it's a big slab serif. And so slab serifs are serif typefaces where the serifs look like bricks at the end of the strokes. It's available in a bunch of different weights, so it goes from really light to really heavy, and it also has a sans serif version, which is the serif version without feet on it. It's super identifiable. It's definitely fit to the purpose of describing M&M's new brand motto, which is a place where everyone feels at home. Yeah, I love that typeface.
What made you want to have Steffi on the podcast today?
When I first met Steffi, she asked really great questions about typography. She was really keen to know more about type design. And she was so engaged in that type design project for M&M's that I forgot for a tiny moment that she was in charge of a lot of other brands too. And that really made me want to know more about her. Yeah, and I'm nothing if not curious, so I had to know more.
Amazing. Handing it off to Charles and Steffi for today's episode.
Steffi Marty is the Global Director of Brand Identity at Mars Snacking, and if that sounds abstract, you'll probably know the brands that she oversees. The Mars Bar, M&M's, Snickers, and Skittles. She's been with Mars for a little over 6 years, 12 if you count her time as Senior Brand Identity Manager for Wrigley. She has a Master's in Design Research and Strategy from the Illinois Institute of Technology and a Bachelor of Science in Industrial Design from Hunan University. And I'm really honored that she found time to talk to me today. Welcome, Steffi.
Thank you, Charles. Great to be here.
Let's begin with this idea that you are the creative leader. It's not an idea, it's an actuality. You are the creative leader of a brand of brands. I gave a very brief idea of what that means, but in your own words, could you describe what you do and the teams that you typically work with?
Of course. Even though, as you say, I'm the creative lead, I actually find that the most inspiring things are our brands and our consumers. So a lot of the work we do is very much inspired by the heritage and DNAs of the brand, as well as the world we live in and the consumers in it. What I look after are some very well-known and beloved brands. As you mentioned, M&M's, Snickers, Skittles, Dove Galaxy, Orbit Extra, chewing gum, etc. I look after the brand identity for those brands, and specifically the very valuable distinctive assets, as well as the full set of identity, how we use them across the different touch points, basically things that consumers see and it remembers us by.
I'm interested in that description because you flipped it almost immediately. And so often we think of like brand as what we're projecting out into the world, but you actually started with the idea of the people who are the consumers, the people who are receiving the messages. I like that as a tack. I wonder what that means in the real world. Are you conducting consumer research? How do you get information about how people are responding to the brand as it is and where you want to take it?
As people say that the most important skill in communication is actually listening, because if you listen well, then you know what the other party cares about the best and what's the best way to speak to them. And it's the same for building brands and looking after brands. We build our brands on what we call brand compass, which is the strategic compass of what the brand exists in the world for. And that is also very much consumer oriented. Like, what do they need and what can we offer? When it comes to design, we very much lean into various ways to be inspired by them, from audit we do before design even starts, or as we have design options, we look to co-create with consumers via appropriate forms of research, various forms of getting feedback. And then we're looking at more and more the new frontier of how do we just in general co-create brands with consumers, make brands a more living and breathing thing, and definitely not a one-way sort of broadcast.
Conceptually, we sort of understand, I think all of us, that is where branding is going. I would love to unpack that just a tiny bit, Steffi. So as you co-create with your consumers, what does the exchange of information look like? What part of the creative onus is on them?
There are various ways that we can co-create with consumers. In more traditional ways, we include consumers in our design process, invite them for input on various directions we were exploring. We still very much shape the brand, but it is with consumers' voice. And there are also ways that we're opening up to consumers. We invite influencers and consumers to interact with the brand on TikTok and various channels. And frankly, there are many things that we don't even know what they are today that we want to explore doing. And definitely, we have a vision and a desire for the brands to just really embrace the inspiration and ideas and desires of consumers and invite them in to shape the brand together.
My mind is racing as I sit here because it is it's almost a revolutionary concept of identity, of identifying products that I think is so different than the way that we approached creating awareness around brands 50 years ago or 30 years ago. And it as difficult as it is to think about letting go, the rewards are gigantic, obviously, if you invite consumers into that equation. As a result of the size of your brand, as a result of the amount of time that you've been working at this with Mars, you're actually part of the change. And I wonder if you could describe to me what your journey to becoming a global director of brand identity and design was like. Where did it start? When did you sort of begin to realize that you had something that you could bring to this really specific equation?
Of course. It probably started when I was in college. I studied industrial design in Hunan University in China, as you mentioned, and design was a fairly new discipline at the time. I was very fortunate to study at a school with a quite pioneering and solid program. And our focus was more industrial design and sort of the science side of design per se. But I had a keen interest in graphic design. The teacher I had was really good at making the subject seem very interesting and very rich. And I always just know there is a love for that. And growing up, I always loved Swiss type design or German type design or really bold graphic interpretation of storytelling. And even though my first job after I graduated was very much in the structural design aspect and sort of the more 3D side of design, I was very excited to be given an opportunity to work on brand identity side of things when the opportunity opened up in Munich for Wrigley. I'm always been fascinated by the idea of communication in general. Being somebody who grew up in China and moved to the United States, English not being my first language at the time, just kind of struggled to get an idea across sometimes succinctly and engagingly. I still remember when I first came to the country and everyone was so friendly to me, but they would like walk away from me in the party because I was pretty boring, couldn't get my ideas across. From very early on, I just had a intuitive kind of liking to the design, but also fascinated by the idea of communication. It's always had a bit of a sort of a new toy feeling, like I'm still trying to figure out all the things this toy can do and all the interesting things I can get out of it.
In terms of like thinking of graphic design as a form of communication, I think that's a leap that most people make much, much later, and that it was a formal part of your experience of moving from China to Munich and then to the States is pretty intriguing to me. Like that it's almost baked into your experience that you become someone aware of the way that graphic design plays in a much larger communication setting.
Indeed. So my journey actually is from China to Chicago and then from Chicago to Munich and Munich back to Chicago.
More zigzaggy than I put it.
It's very zigzaggy. And the school I went to in Chicago, it was is the new Bauhaus. And you will laugh at this because for the 2 years I was in the design school, and a lot of people, they probably think, wow, design school, you guys must have fun presentations, like throw all the colors on one page. In this design school, all the presentations we make basically is in gray and then the pop of orange. And I kind of loved it. And even today, when I make a presentation, I always do my presentation in black and white. I don't go into design till the content is complete. Perhaps there is part of me that fundamentally resent people consider design as decoration. It's how you make things pretty. I think really design is what makes things very effective. And it's that almost ruthless discipline to weed out the things that are unnecessary, the things that are unelegant, and really surface what's the essential aspect of the storytelling. That's probably why I'm so passionate about the communication aspect of design.
It's funny. Well, I can tell you the parallel experience because I went to a Bauhaus model school at the Cooper Union. And of course, we were told you can use any typeface you want as long as it's Helvetica. And you can use any colors you want as long as they're black or gray or red. And that was it. And even today, in speaking to the folks at Monotype about discipline and typography, I said, here's what you can do. Just to sort of establish this as discipline, use 10-point Helvetica, flush left, rag right, with 15 points of lead, and do it on a 4-inch margin because a 4-inch line length will give you exactly 65 characters. And then, if the text doesn't tell you to do anything else, don't do anything else. But that's where you start. You start with discipline. And from that, the content will tell you what it needs to be if you're listening carefully enough. So yes, I'm very much in your camp.
Absolutely. I love your parallel experience.
Well, how many of our instructors in the past 20 or 30 years were emigres from Europe post-World War II? Mine happened to be from Czechoslovakia. Those who founded the Bauhaus School were from various parts of Germany, the Bauhaus School in Chicago. So yeah, it's not that surprising, but it's almost like a religious dogmatism that you learn and have to react to in one way or another. And that is to sort of take it as gospel or to respond to it with an idea of your own. And I'd say a lot of the work that you've been doing with the brands at Mars, it's obviously not in keeping with that very austere, strip it all down, develop discipline, and then build it back up. These are brands that through their design and typography really have to rely on some measure of historical resonance, like brands that have existed for a long time and that people expect to look a certain way. but also just exist in a brand space where they need to sort of grab somebody by the lapel and say, this is sweet, or this is amazing, this is bright, this is inclusive. Like, they need to say through their design what they are. How do you navigate that sort of push and pull between your own personal aesthetic and creative bent and what the design needs to be for the brands?
That's a brilliant question, and one I often ask myself. Our brands and design are very much led by the brand compass that I mentioned, which is the sort of strategic document that articulates what role does the brand play and what are we offering to consumers that they want / care about. And a lot of our design exploration and the evaluation go back to that. And we also work with incredible design agencies that have a breadth of experience across industries. So they often bring in very compelling point of views. I think it's fair and unavoidable that my point of view and quite often that comes in as a form of intuition when I know a design is right or not, and whether a design is as good as it can be. And some of my principles of creating design and evaluating design definitely plays a constant role. The first thing I believe is a design is done when there is nothing to remove, not when there is nothing to add. And it's the idea that we should always be really economical and be very conscious of clutter and really only keep the essentials and make those work really hard and never add anything frivolous or unnecessary. And perhaps there is an element of Bauhaus in it. The idea of form forever follows function, etc. is the idea that every element should have a job. I actually often remember, I don't know how true it is, but it is a story that that's shared even in books. Early on, there was a designer who worked for the Wrigley company, and he presented an idea, and the owner was kind of like, I don't really like it. And the designer at the time basically said to him, it's not for you, and I don't really care if you like it or not. It is for your brand, and your consumers will like it. There's some truth to it. But as somebody in the industry, I also generally value the instinct that somebody who is a professional designer brings to the table. I feel if our instinct tells us something is right or wrong, that is a voice to be valued.
As you describe it, or as you're describing it, I'm thinking back to the sort of that very fundamental aspect of the Bauhaus, where the point was to sort of strip down all of the artifice and get to the point of a creativity born out of our sort of most fundamental selves.
Mm-hmm.
And that is instinctual.
Mm-hmm.
That becomes very much about your own way of communicating, your own way of imagining form, and less influenced by traditional models of style. And you've described almost both sides of that same coin as sort of guiding principles, which of course makes sense. Trusting instinct, but also sort of looking for form and function to be very much in a handshake is, yeah, it's great. Add into that the idea that the consumer has a voice in it, and, taking into account that we're designing empathetically for somebody else, not for ourselves, it's a tidy package.
You summarize it perfectly. I'm going to have to remember to say that in my next stakeholder meeting.
What is your favorite brand at Mars? Like, what's the one that is sort of nearest and dearest to you? The one that, all your children are equal, but which one do you like the most?
From a product point of view, I'm a huge fan of M&M pretzels. I just feel like it has such a great combination of texture and sweet and savory. From a design point of view, I have a very special kind of soft spot for Skittles. It is a really fun and interesting brand that with a very strong, distinctive point of view. And it is so fun to try to define a brand that resists to be defined.
I love that you can you're describing the magic trick, but it doesn't sort of take away from the actual trick that the magic is doing, which is to astound. I mean, it's the most meta brand. It's the one that wants to sort of every time you try and pigeonhole it to become something else. I'm going to switch this just a tiny bit because it's not all taste the rainbow and lollipops. What are your biggest challenges at Mars or in your career, and how have you coped with them?
When I was younger, I took such comfort in being able to do the same thing again and again and get better at it. For example, as a designer, you get better and better at your sketching skills, and that comes with practice. Yes, projects are different, but sort of the skill set you're honing and sharpening are very similar. And I generally took a lot of comfort in that iterative and repetitive process. And I think as I advanced in my career, that ability to almost kind of hold still and just kind of perfect your tricks of the trade has become more of a luxury. And it's the idea and the awareness that you are responsible of finding the new frontier and find people for the best job and figure out things that wasn't even a topic a year ago is both a new sensation and a challenge. But as I said, I think from a personal point of view, it's constantly being outside your comfort zone is sometimes a challenge for me.
Yeah, the way I've been thinking about that very thing that you just articulated beautifully is that we want as sort of hardworking people to be as productive as possible, to be useful in the jobs that we do. That's productivity. It's making the things in the way that we know how to make them. And I mean, we all know at least I know from calligraphy, and you probably know from something that you've done along the way, that flow state comes from that repetition. It comes from a sort of place of productivity, of making without sort of engaging your mind directly, but instead sort of engaging your being. But with productivity, you just make more of the same thing. It takes creativity to actually take you to a new place, and that requires a whole different set of skills, one of which is productivity, hard work. But I mean, there are other things, just like looking for something new, being open to working with others. Like there are a lot of things that go into creativity that we don't get from just being purely productive. And yes, I could see, I mean, especially in your position, that not only having to do the trick over and over again, like be creative over and over again, but challenge yourself to what creative meant last time and how it can be different this time.
And that's why my favorite thing to do on the weekend is to build Legos following page by page instruction where no decision making is required.
I love that. And I mean, it's similar with following a recipe out of a book to make a meal for my family on the weekend. It's sort of a special treat for them, but methodical and sort of not mindless, but mindful in a different way.
Exactly.
So I know you have to travel a lot for work. Tell me some of the things that you like about that and some of the things that you don't. And do you have any like special tips for people who have a lot of travel in their lives?
I love traveling. I always loved it. My parents are still waiting for me to tell them one day that I don't want to go back to Munich or to London because they were like, you've been there for 40 times or whatever. For me, as somebody who grew up in China, who lived in Europe and still have dear friends there, traveling to me feels like never really far from home because I have families and friends in most of the places I travel to anyhow. And I forever also have that sense of wonderment in wherever I go. So it's actually quite a perk that I consider that work brings me to new places and meet new people. And even if I go back to the same place, usually something has changed. It's like you can never kind of step in the same river twice kind of thing. There's always new things to see and experience. And on the other hand, there's also something wonderfully magical to get on a plane, land 8 hours later and feel at home.
Yeah.
basically to travel is one of the best ways to broaden your horizon, to not forget your problems, but just like see things from new perspectives that brings so much enlightenment and joy. And I also encourage anyone who has the opportunity to even work abroad or even in a different city, because you will gain understanding that almost cannot be gained otherwise. Money spent on travel, time spent on travel will never be wasted.
Let's say tomorrow you're going to Munich or London or Paris, wherever. What is the first thing that you want to do when you get off of a plane after you've checked in at your hotel?
I really like just walking around and kind of like expose yourself to the elements. For example, like even if whether it's raining or it's sunny outside, I just like to get outside. One, is supposed to really help you with jet lag, to kind of connect yourself to the elements of the new location. And two, just there's always so much to see. And never waste a meal when you travel, because life is too short to eat mediocre food.
Amen.
And usually one of the first things I do is I run to a grocery store to buy fruits, because vitamins are important when you travel.
I totally agree with all of that advice. It's as if you're reading my diary. I remember Henry James saying in one book or another that the best way to get to know any place and its people is to just get out on the street and walk. Like, don't get in a cab, don't get in a carriage, don't get on a bicycle. Walk the streets, smell the smells, feel the weather, get to know the place. And you can only do that when you're on foot. And then you work up an appetite and you go to a grocery store and you find out what passes for produce in a place.
Totally. Although biking can be also really exciting.
It's true. You can cover a lot of ground, right?
Exactly. I went to bike in London and I would never forget. I was just like casually kind of looking at the beautiful scenes, and I turned around, this double-deck bus was like half a meter from me. That was really scary.
You felt alive though.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you some questions for the career builders out there. What advice would you have for folks who are trying to break into or contemplating a career in design and branding, or somebody who's busy shaping or reshaping the arc of their career?
I would say if you have the choice and if that kind of suits your vision of how you want to shape your career, try to start your career at an agency. There is so much to be learned being with people who are like-minded or people who have similar skill set, because agency by nature is a wonderful collection of people who are experts in the area. On the agency side, you get to see really wide breadth of industries, of types of clients, and of types of problems you're trying to solve. It's a wonderful place to build up the muscles, to build up the resilience that can down the road be really helpful on the client side. And I will very honestly say, based on my personal experience, I'm glad that I had the path of working at an agency for a few years and coming to the client side, because I think it will be difficult for me to kind of go the other way. Another suggestion I have is for people to know that whatever the job is in front of you, just start somewhere. There may not be sort of a perfect job out there for you at the get-go. Whatever opportunity there is in front of you, just pick it up and do the best job you can. And there's always things to be learned, always relationship to be built, always knowledge to be collected. And you never know what you might need or what might be helpful to you down the road. And there's often so many different paths to a destination, and it's helpful just to jump in and not wait for sort of the perfect job to show up.
I think it's so wise. None of it is a dress rehearsal. We're not preparing for something that's about to come. So if you find yourself in any position, it's time to get busy and do the best you can with it, because you know something will come after it, but you're not sure what that will be yet. Best to be engaged where you are. So you and I have worked together on a project. We worked on the M&M's typeface, All Together Sans Together, which made quite a splash. I like to think it was entirely the typeface, but I know it was the remaking of the characters. It was the repositioning of the brand. There were a lot of things going on there, but the typeface is near and dear to me. It was one of the most fun experiences that I've had working on a typeface for a customer, and you can imagine there are quite a few of those, so for something to stand out is pretty spectacular. Now, I make custom typefaces, and Monotype makes custom typefaces all the time. So my view of what the experience is like is fairly warped. I wonder if you could describe the process for you when you see it out there in the wild on television, on products, on merchandise, and in the store, on Instagram, and everywhere else. What was the process from beginning to end like for you?
It's really fun to kind of reflect back because embarking the journey to design a bespoke typeface with you guys for M&M's was one of the first few brands under our portfolio that have done so. For a very long time, it felt like the natural thing just to get an off-the-shelf font. And it's I would say, under-leveraged area in the identity. And as communication becoming more and more important for brands, it only elevated the importance of the font because fonts are the visual tone of voice of the brand, and they can take on such a personality one way or another. And we're really happy that we went down the path to design our own. It wasn't too difficult for me to convince the broader team that we should have our own font. Really, we just kind of jumped in straight with you guys, with JKR, our brand design agency, on all the various ways we can go about it. And I'm really grateful that we found somebody so knowledgeable and established as you, Charles, and Monotype by extension. I still remember that when you showed us your sort of process of kind of pulling out the brand elements that are used as foundation for inspiration, and how that was sort of a compass of pulling the personality out and amplify it this way. It is so interesting and in a way very logical. So the connection back to the Bauhaus ideology, having logic, is really reassuring. It doesn't take away the magic of the creativity. Is just that a story can be told and traced with confidence. And it felt like a really easy process in the way that a lot of the creative work was done at the beginning, really rigorously. It felt pretty smooth sailing. And it was so amazing when the font was shaped to a point we could start using it, pairing it with our other assets, and everyone just feel such emotional reaction to the work. We almost cannot picture the world where we had this pretty constrained, I think it was DIN, which was our old font, the German highway font. It's a beautiful font, but not the best font for a fun candy brand.
We agree. Nothing but love for DIN, but yeah, there was probably an opportunity missed there.
Yes, and we love the font so much. And for any big redesign, the timeline was never really easy because there's so many moving parts. You probably still remember we worked with you to pull out an outline version of the font.
Yes.
So our team who worked on the M&M store that was opening up in Berlin can basically lay it letter by letter to have things go to print before the font file was technically ready. We just didn't want to miss the opportunity to bring it to the world.
I was so with you on that one because I thought you don't get to do that too often. Those kind of installations, you know, and I know that once you get into 3 and 4 dimensions, the timing involved is crazy.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I was with you. We can't miss it. It had to happen. And props to JKR, obviously, because they really guided a lot of that investigation into where the brand was and where it was going, in conjunction with you, obviously, in conjunction with the customers. But there was such a sense of joy and camaraderie I felt in the making of that project that when I go to the M&M store on 42nd Street, it makes me so happy. And I hope it makes you happy too.
Absolutely.
So the year is still young. What's your creative focus for Mars in 2024? What do you want to achieve by year's end or to set in motion?
I feel like I'm talking to my boss because he was like, I'll give you 2 weeks to write your objectives. So I'm having a flashback.
Oh, no.
Without getting into too much details, there are always brands on our roster that it's the year for their brand world to get a refresh and sometimes a redesign. It is also a year that we are keen to look at what's the most optimal, exciting, and responsible way to potentially leverage AI in our design process. Obviously, that's a really complex area. And for me personally, I'm really excited that we have a new member coming in for the European region. And I'm really excited to kind of have our team at full strength again, and just another really, really strong addition to our small but mighty team.
All right. So I'm sorry for putting you on the hot seat. I didn't mean to trigger some stress disorder.
No, it's all good.
Let's move to something slightly easier to answer. What are you reading, or what movies have you seen? What music are you listening to? Like, what's inspiring you right now?
There is a book that I'm reading called What You're Looking For Is in the Library. It's a really sweet Japanese book. It's fictional. It's about how a librarian was able to kind of recommend books to people that helped, whether intentionally or unintentionally, and gave them answers in their lives. The interesting about a book is that you kind of take what you're looking for / what you're ready for from it. So different people read the same book, get probably different ideas. And it's a really sweet little book. And I love books.
So say the title of it again, because I think it's very on brand for you.
It totally is. It's called What You're Looking For Is in the Library.
It's fantastic. I love that idea that somebody who manages brands would then pick a book that is about sort of helping other people find out what motivates them.
Yes, it's really cool. And movies. A friend of mine recommended me the movie Marcel. And I'm ashamed that I missed it last year when it first came out. And I don't know if you've watched it. It's totally quirky, and it's basically like a talking shell. And the shell was part of a documentary, and they end up having really in-depth, endearing conversations and deeply touching. I find myself really mesmerized and deeply touched by the conversation of like friendship, family, loss, sort of how one lives with one's limitation. Because when you're a little shell, there's a lot of limitations in life. You cannot lift things, and et cetera, et cetera.
I love Jenny Slate, and Marcel the Shell is amazing. I'm glad you gave that a boost because it's fantastic. You have been absolutely great putting up with my sort of quixotic bouncing around questions. I'm really glad that we had some time to talk. It's been amazing to hear about what makes you who you are. And until, I suppose, next time, keep being creative. Please.
I definitely will. And Charles, I know you're an amazing font designer, but I think you also have a career in being a therapist.
Aw.
Because you ask really good questions, and with that kind of perfect, soothing voice that I feel like anyone who talks to you is going to feel like, man, I should have a conversation like this more often.
Aw. Well, I'm lucky to know amazing people, and you're among them. So thank you, Steffi.
Thank you.
If you'd like to see the brands that Steffi manages, head over to mars.com. And if you'd like to see the Altogether typeface in use, visit mms.com.
As always, look for a link to our blog post in the show notes of this episode, and check out monotype.com/podcast to read all about our prior guests. If you've been enjoying our podcast, please rate it and review this episode. And if you really like us, subscribe to the show and share us with your friends. Creative Characters is brought to you by Monotype. It's produced by Christopher Olin, Mia Sullivan, and Marie Tabarez. We'll be back with more episodes soon. Take care.